Secretary, I will try speaking this.
It's kind of a small table. It's a good definition of trade. There's never quite enough to go around.
Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour, bienvenue à Paris, bienvenue.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to Paris. Welcome to the OECD. We're going to start this session. I'm going to introduce myself. I am François Naudelet-Langlois. I'm a journalist at Le Figaro, and I'm going to moderate this round table on the faces of trade.
Welcome to Paris, good morning, and welcome to the 2018 OECD Forum. My name is Fabrice Naudelet-Langlois. I'm a journalist with the French daily newspaper Le Figaro, and I will be moderating this panel. Just a few practical information. This debate should stop at 10:15. One of my goals as a moderator is to leave at least 15 minutes at the end of the panel to allow you in the audience to send questions. One way of asking questions will be to use the internet. Website should appear. You can use the Bcast website on your smartphone. The address is www.bcast.com/OECD2. I think it appears. And then you just have to send your questions. They will appear in front of me, and I will give you the floor. So feel free to ask questions. If there are not enough questions through the mobile, I'll try to see you and give you the floor. Just a short introduction of our very distinguished panelists. If you don't mind, ladies first. Sigrid Kaag, welcome to Paris and good morning. You are since last October the Minister of Trade and Development Cooperation of the Netherlands. You have previously worked in the late 80s for the oil company Shell. You then held a series and many international positions, including the United Nations Relief and Works Agency in Jerusalem, or to mention another one, UNICEF. You all have in your files much more detailed resumes of our very distinguished panelists. Mr. Ross, Wilbur Ross, as people should know, you are the Secretary of Commerce of the United States. Welcome. This is your first job as a government official. Prior to that, you gathered 55 years of experience in investment banking and private equity, restructuring companies in various industries, including steel, if I'm not mistaken. And as we are in Paris, among the many positions you held, I wanted to mention one. You have been a member of the International Council of the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris. Is that correct? Yeah. Yeah. This is the past, or are you still a member of this council?
Well, past. I had to get rid of all those associations with the joining government.
Okay. We have with us next to Sigrid Kaag, Ricardo Oteros. Welcome. Raised in Spain, you belong to a family of farmers. And after graduating in the Universidad Complutense de Madrid, you traveled to Colombia as a young student, and there you fell in love with coffee and with coffee culture. And when you went back to your home country, Spain, you created Supra Café, a company that sells very high quality Colombian coffee. And you work closely with growers back in Colombia. So trade is just part of your daily life, and you will tell us more about it. And lastly, we have with us Rick Johnston. Welcome. You are the Managing Director of International Government Affairs at Citibank. In this position, you are in relations with governments from all over the world, basically. You worked for the US International Trade Commission, as well as International Trade Council to the Finance Committee of the US Senate. That's long to say. And you are here at home as you are a member of the Business and Industry Advisory Committee to the OECD. Again, you will find more details about our guests in your files. Now, I am aware that you are eager to hear Secretary Ross's remarks and comments, or even maybe announcements, given the current situation and trade disputes or talks. I will certainly ask him questions on these hot issues, and you are free to ask him questions. But let me remind you that this panel has been dubbed the Faces of Trade, and we would like to focus on how trade policies, how free trade agreements, or how trade barriers really affect people throughout the world, be it in Paris or Detroit, in Amsterdam or Popayan, Colombia. And to start with, I wanted to give the floor first to our two representatives of the business community, and to start with you, Ricardo Oteros. So your company, Supra Café, is at the forefront of international trade. You work between Colombia and Spain. Can you tell us how your business, maybe not only Supra Café, but the whole coffee industry that you very well know, can be affected or has been affected either by trade barriers, norms, or on the opposite, by free trade agreements? Can you give us some really practical examples of how trade affects your business? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I want to say thanks to OECD to invite us to be here. Second, I have to excuse myself if I make some mistakes with my English, but I will try to explain. Supra Café is working with small producers in a coffee region since a long time ago. And these producers has less than 1 hectare, and they face a lot of challenges. Coffee business is estimated that 100 million persons lives around coffee. 80% of all these people comes from smallholders farms. Coffee is mainly traded like a commodity, so this is a problem for us because sometimes producers are looking more to the stock exchange than the sky, the weather. And they face big problems with the main challenges they face is lacks of finance. When they get finance, they get a very high price, lacks of knowledge and technical training, non-formal jobs, non-generational relief. I mean, young people is leaving the farms. In the average of age in producers in Colombia is 58 years old. So poorness, because they are mainly poor, is a multidimensional phenomenon. And since my point of view, to fight effectively against this poverty, we need an holistic approach based in SDGs, so an holistic community-based development. Of course, trade is one important piece of this puzzle. So for us, through trade, we can put the value of these SDGs from the consumer to the producer, to the farmer. So, but we have to take into consideration that it's not only trade, it's all these challenges they are facing.
But since you started your business, how did you see the situation change for the producers you work with in Colombia?
So
focusing on trade.
The improve is coming always by all these kind of things that I'm telling you. For instance, there is a good demand of high-quality coffees, but to produce high-quality coffees, you have to train people. You have to give them they need. I mean, the meals. You have to do so. As you are putting together the consumer with the producer and working together, you can get more value added. So there are some initiatives like Sustainable Coffee Challenge is made with the industry, many of companies. It was started in the United States. And what we are doing with the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, for instance, is trying to train people, to give them chances to do things. And of course, trade have to put this to recognize this high value of the coffee.
And do you see that some markets are clearly less open to your products than the others? Are there really strong barriers that prevent you to sell your coffee in some countries? Or?
No, we don't find barriers. Well, we find barriers when they try to sell the raw material. When they try to sell roasted coffee, they find barriers, you know. But there's not barriers because this is a raw material who is produced in this kind of developing countries. It's not produced in our countries, so we don't find this. What we find is that the people is so afraid that the movement of the commodity markets, it's for a smallholder, this is not sustainable. I mean, they make a big effort during 1 year or 2 years, and in one market situation, because I don't know, maybe the Secretary Rose will explain us, is going down or up, and it's nothing to do with coffee. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I wanted to give the floor to Rick Johnston. So we deal with a rather different business than the coffee producing. You work for a big bank and you travel all around the world. From your experience, and you also work in the US for the Senate, and you have a very varied experience. Do you feel that these past years barriers have rather increased, or do you feel on the opposite that it's easier to trade?
Yeah, it'd be nice to say it's easier to trade. You know, I think for this topic, we have to take a big step back and look at what has been accomplished under the Bretton Woods system and the WTO and the rules-based trade system. And it's remarkable when you think of the advances, the development of wealth, the distribution of wealth that's taken place since 1948. And really importantly, and something we tend to forget about in today's world, is almost the miracle of how this interconnectedness that has been created by the free trade system has suppressed the otherwise probable conflicts that could take place. I mean, literally, people shooting at one another. And when you look at, for example, the situation in eastern Ukraine, if that had taken place maybe 40 years ago, it would have been far more outrageous than what's going on right now. We're now, by virtue of sanctions, by virtue of pressures that are economic, because of that interconnectedness, we're able to try to deal with that problem without war, quite literally. And I think in today's generation, we've got to remind ourselves that this concept of free trade is not just for economic benefit, but it's also to create the kind of dialogue that will allow us to work out our problems with lack of conflict. But this theme that we are talking about today in terms of trade is free trade, and then the protection of jobs are they sort of adverse? Are they conflicting? And when I tried to think about how to describe it for purposes of today, I'd call it more like a yin and yang relationship, where free trade and jobs are interconnected. They are, in fact, dependent upon one another. And if we look at it in that way, and we look at it as a way to not only promote jobs and promote good-paying jobs through free trade and through the development of economic, we'll call it wealth, on a broader scale, then I think we're going to have a better perspective on how to deal with this question of, quote, protectionism. I used to work, as you noted, at the International Trade Commission. And this is one of those faces of trade stories where we would have to sit there. I was an attorney advisor to one of the commissioners. And we would have to sit there. And part of our job was to decide whether or not imports were actually causing the kind of problems that, whether it was our farmers or producers of steel or what have you, whether those imports were really causing the kind of problems that the industry was suffering from. And I have to tell you, there were hearings where we would be listening to family farmers coming in and literally weeping in front of us. It was really hard for me to watch this. But then to take that statute that we were administering and deciding whether or not, one, there was the kind of injury that warrants protection. Two, was it really caused by the imports, or was it by reason of something else? Maybe it's excessive regulation. Maybe it was a tax system. It could have been a variety of other reasons. And very often, in particularly in safeguards cases, which we probably ought to discuss today sometime, we had to say, no, it was not by virtue of imports. It was by virtue of many other factors that led to the problem that that particular industry was having.
And it's not always easy to make the discrepancy, to see what
That's right.
factors are at play. And your long-term perspective was very interesting, but the fact is that nowadays there seems to be a growing skepticism around the world towards trade, and not only in the US, of course, we are all focusing on the Trump administration's policy, but it seems that there is skepticism rising all over the world. Is it an observation you share, Sigrid Kaag, and do you have explanation? Why is there this growing skepticism, maybe not only towards trade, but towards globalization as a whole?
Oh, that's a big topic. Well, I think we have to, let me just, first of all, disentangle myself from the cord. Thank you. Skepticism, I think skepticism is probably still an intellectual approach. Skepticism means a critical inquiry about value of trade or the impact of globalization, but there are many questions in there. I think my deepest concern is a populist approach to globalization, which means insufficient analysis of the benefits of a global economy, insufficient analysis or proposals how we can improve. So our mainstay is always that free trade is as old as mankind or humankind, same as migration. How we manage, channel, and regulate trade, the level playing field, very much so as referenced, is important. So globalization according to the rules, within a system, the WTO, standards that we try to improve, enforce, or seek compliance with, I think that's the way to go. But very often it's a label that's thrown out either by activists or countries that are seeking to artificially protect themselves from what they feel is a selective consequence of globalization, notwithstanding, if you take a holistic look, globalization has the benefits of globalization, of a globalized economy, outweigh. However, for developing countries, and I'm putting on my two hats now, in terms of a development perspective, we need to understand how there can be a distortive effect, how there can be a setback, and how we can make sure that all truly can really participate in a global economy. So globalization or a global economy. I think I speak to a global economy, and then we need to see where duty bearers, such as states ourselves, can contribute and say, what are the rules of the game now? What isn't working? And how do we need to reform and improve? I'm a firm advocate of improving the functioning of the WTO. I think we all are. We'll come back to that. Then secondly, the skeptics in terms of does it bring disadvantages? Yes, but I think it's usually the poor, or rather the unemployed in the developed world, that are feeling that they're further disenfranchised, the changing nature of work, and I don't think it's about jobs versus globalization. I think it's about the changing nature of job, the right to be employed, and what type of employment you can expect of the future. I think we need to put the agenda, the future of work, firmly. There will be more honest politics and more honest policy, as there are jobs that will always be phasing out. We're not in the 19th century, we're not in the 20th, we're now in the 21st century. Hence the course of interaction, the type of technologies available, cycles of jobs will change. We need to have lifelong learning. We need to invest in a type of education system that enables people to compete on the labor market. And then, of course, when it comes to developing countries, we need to ensure that they are not even further lagging behind. But when we look at everything that is a global economy through the lens of sustainability and sustainable development, that applies to the Netherlands, US, as well as Colombia, Spain. It applies to all of us because it's a universal agenda we've all signed up to. Thank you.
Thank you. By the way, before giving the floor to Secretary Ross, it's interesting to note that your portfolio deals with both trade and development cooperation. It's
Yes.
not the case in all the countries, and it's not the case in France, for instance.
To the jealousy, certainly, or positive envy, I would call it, of many of my European colleagues, because there is a connect. Most of what we do using precious taxpayers' money in developing country can only be catalytic. Ultimately, most countries, rightly so, want to build their economy, they want to have foreign direct investment, they want to grow the private sector, they want to build an economic base that is independent and autonomous, that brings them up to a level they can compete internationally. We use more and more ODA on the nexus of aid and trade, because we want to phase out and really sort of strengthen the economic base of any country, and then particularly using, of course, ODA money to bring women and the right of women and girls to compete on that labor market, to give them a chance. 50% of the world's population cannot be excluded from any level of economic activity.
Thank you. Secretary Ross, what's your take on this growing skepticism on trade? Mrs. Carr mentioned populism, the way populism is regarding trade. What can you answer on this or comment?
Well, I think every country's primary obligation is to protect its own citizens and their livelihoods. So maybe that's a populist saying, but it's one that we feel very strongly about. But I think free trade is much more often spoken about than practiced. And that's the biggest concern that we have. People who are excellent at the rhetoric but does not match that with their behavior. So one of our principal objectives is to have the behavior of the free trade exponents match their rhetoric. So far, we have not been very successful in achieving that, but we will continue. So I think there's a real disconnect. Second, it isn't just uneducated people who are skeptical about trade, nor is it just the unemployed people. We, right now, have very low unemployment in the U.S. We're at 3.9 or maybe a little south of that. So we don't have endemic unemployment at the moment. But that has not changed either the government's attitude or the population's attitude toward trade. I put trade into two categories, and trade deficits especially into two categories. One is what I would call blameless ones. U.S. historically, for example, had not been self-sufficient in hydrocarbons, so we were going to have to be an importer. China is not self-sufficient in food, so they have to be an importer. Therefore, there's no point criticizing the people from whom you're buying something that you cannot possibly supply yourself. Where it gets dicier is when people don't follow the rules, when the enforcement mechanisms are inadequate, and even more so when the rules become obsoleted. Concessions that were perfectly appropriate for U.S. to make to Europe, to Asia, to everywhere in the immediate years after World War II are no longer appropriate. But the concessions were not time-denominated. They were permanent concessions. That's a real structural problem. And it leads to lots of inequities, lots of trade barriers that are quite asymmetrical, both tariff and non-tariff. So there is a lot to complain about. And for those who think we're not free trade, if U.S. is not the most free trade of the big countries, please tell me who is.
Any comment on this, Mrs. Carr?
I don't think we're at odds on all themes, not at all. And of course, when it comes to, that's why I mentioned particularly the reform of the WTO, maybe there's maybe a slight nuance in the approach taken by the European Union versus the US, but I think there's a shared agenda. If you also go back to the joint statement between US, EU and Japan at the end of the WTO in terms of the level playing field and how we can take it forward. Many of the issues that Secretary Ross mentioned, we are firmly, I think, side by side, and they need to be tackled. State subsidies, market distortion, and the effect of these types of subsidies on market distortion, absolutely, and a modernization of the WTO. But as member states, we take this more as a European sort of multilaterally organized country. We feel we have the duty to reform from within, whilst withholding and sustaining what has worked in the 70 years. If you go back, of course, to the European Union itself, it started as, in a way, a conflict prevention entity, comes back to your point, the European economic market, and it was an economic project with a political vision. We're not saying that everybody else should follow that model, but definitely there is a link also between economic and social stability, I think, which we all seek for our own countries, social cohesion, through employment, adaptation to the employment scope that exists in a changing world. But rules of the game definitely needs to be adhered by all. I firmly stand by that as well, and I think concur fully with Secretary Ross.
Can I add a little bit? Because I think the Secretary makes a really important point that is lost in the coverage of how nations right now are conducting their trade relations. There's fair trade, and then there's unfair trade. And to call it protectionist and then label it as a bad thing is sort of like saying it's bad for you to enforce your contract rights. And there is a lot of unfair trade going on right now, and quite probably I think your administration is making a valid point. In the past, we have taken all of these rules for granted, and there has not really been an active enforcement effort as much as could have been done. I think a lot of the rules, quite frankly, do apply to the problems we have today. And I would submit, Mr. Secretary, that it's not the institutions themselves that are anachronistic, it's the rules. And the rules do need to be updated, that's for sure. NAFTA is a good example. Now, I don't know if I'd go as far as our government wants us to go on NAFTA, but the fact of the matter is that not only in the WTO, but I think the OECD can make a major contribution to helping upgrade all of these rules, as you point out, to the modern day, the 21st century. That is necessary.
But I think it's not just the rules, it's also the mindset. If you look at a typical annual report of the WTO, page after page complains that there are more trade actions than there used to be, and they always label that protectionist. It apparently never occurs to them that the reason there are more trade actions is there are more trade infractions. And so the mindset that anything that an exporter chooses to do is fine, which is more or less the WTO mindset in my mind, is simply wrong. It doesn't fit the world the way it is today. It's a overly simplistic version of trade and how it goes on. And in terms of enforcement, any dispute mechanism that takes multiple years is no good. The people who've been hurt should have much quicker redress than 5 years. Look at the Airbus situation, how long that's been going on. It's a joke. It really is. And then for some of the member states in the EU to say, oh, well, we'll just tweak it a little bit, is also a wrong mindset. The people are not facing the structural realities.
But how do you think this could be improved? Do we have to totally transform WTO, or do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I think the problem is that people have begun in many multinational organizations to substitute conversation for action. Take the Global Steel Forum, which has been set up.
Here, by this institution that is hosting us, OECD.
It's now had 7 or 8 meetings. They have yet to get all the members even to provide the requisite data. This is 1.5 years or 2 years. These problems are much more urgent than quarterly meetings with no real factual result. So I think the difference between the U.S. approach and many others is we feel a greater sense of urgency for reform than do many of the other countries. And I think that's the most fundamental problem.
But you think that sitting with all the parties around the table is not necessarily the right way to solve problems, because we don't have much choice. If we want to solve a problem, we need to gather with all the parties.
Sure, but the question is what galvanizes the action so that it isn't just a debating society where everyone says, well, gee, we raised all those issues, didn't we do a good job? We don't feel just raising issues is adequate. We think that needs for decisive action. We don't know any more about steel, just to use that example, after these 7 sessions than we did before. And there was no resolution put forward by this group that was meeting, however well-intentioned they were. And that's one of the things that caused our country to take a kind of unilateral step. And we think there is now resulting more continuity, more consistency of approach. Europe all of a sudden has adopted all kinds of safeguards. That didn't come from the Global Steel Forum. That came as a fairly direct response to our 232s. So we think the difference is action versus discussion.
Do you have any comment on your response, Mrs. Carr, or even our other guests?
Yeah,
Mr.
I am agree. Sometimes you look at trade, but trade is a tool. The problem is not trade. The problem is, for instance, when we speak about the problems they face our producers, and we can say, okay, it's only the commodity market, because no, it's not only the commodity market. No, it's not the commodity market. The problem is they need innovation. They are not getting value. The value chain is increasing in our part, in developing countries, in roasted, but not in the producing countries. So we have to do things, and we are a small company, but we do things not thinking in what is happening with trade. Everybody dreams to go out of the commodity just to sell coffee, high quality coffee, and the consumer pay for that. But you need to involve the groups. You need to make research. You need to invest. We are a small company. We invested in Colombia 10 years ago. It was not good scenario because guerrilla and so on, but we invest. You have to do things and you have to change, and you need innovation. Without innovation, there are no progress. Trade will help you to put this in value, as I said at the beginning. But it's not trying to protect the farmers with rules just to get for taxes. No, it's to help them through the trade to get value and to improve their lives.
And if you want innovation, you need investment. And these past years, new free trade agreements wanted to focus on investment. They wanted to facilitate foreign investment, but there has been some backlash. The US stopped the talks on the TTIP, went out of the Pacific Partnership. What's your view on this?
Well, it's not quite accurate to say the U.S. stopped the talks on TTIP. The administration deliberately did not walk away and renounce the TTIP negotiations when we walked away from the TPP. TTIP was an only partially formed agreement. At best, it was maybe 50% of the topics got covered. But we have every single public speaking engagement have signaled we're prepared to engage with the EU. So I don't agree with the characterization that we walked away from TTIP. The EU has shown relatively limited interest in serious negotiation with us, and that's a different component of the problem. TPP, we did walk away from, not because we walked away from the Asia-Pacific region. In fact, our concept is a broader one. It's an Indo-Pacific policy, not just the original TPP countries. But we didn't like many of the terms of the agreement. The rules of origin we felt were worse even than in the old NAFTA. There are a bunch of very specific problems that we had. So it was a particular transaction or agreement that we objected to, not the concept.
Okay. Regarding your question on investment, there's been plenty of empirical analysis showing that foreign direct investment actually draws exports from the country where the parent company is located. So to talk about trade in the context of investment as well, they really go hand in glove. And I think to talk about them in separate contexts is probably a mistake. On the other hand, I'd submit, and this goes to the larger themes of what we're talking about here at the OECD and at the ministerial about multilateralism. Maybe we've taken multilateralism about as far as we can for the moment. And maybe while you don't abandon the idea of sitting around the table and talking through problems and trying to figure out where your common values are and how to approach them, maybe we should step back and start looking at taking pieces of the problems and approaching them on a more singular basis, rather than lumping in everything into a trade negotiation. You know, you were pointing out the European community started as the European coal and steel community, and it was essentially about tariffs. And then it expanded and it expanded and expanded. Now it deals with social issues. And you really wonder, where does a trade agreement stop? Finally, you know, if it's going to have to address human rights questions, if it's going to have to do labor laws, if it's going to have to do environmental, I mean, at some point it becomes a law of diminishing returns when you try to expand this trade dialogue and how to improve trade and improve foreign direct investment. You get just so overwhelmed with all the issues that you go nowhere. So I'd submit, at least personally, that maybe we have to step back. Don't abandon multilateralism, but perhaps this is a way to re-energize it, is to look at it on a more specific basis. That's how we got here, by the way. When you look at all of our trade agreements prior to 1948, they were all bilaterals, but they all had sort of common themes to them. When they finally sat down after World War II and figured, you know, we need a common set of rules, they took the examples from the various bilaterals and they put them together into what we call the GATT. Maybe we should revisit that approach again and try harder at some of these very important questions that address us in this century.
Minister Carr wants to
I think
answer. I'm not sure you agree with all has been said.
Not necessarily, but that's the purpose of the panel, no? I think, first of all, for us, of course, it's important that internationally we remain, we believe firmly in multilateralism, but that's easier said than done. The consensual approach, ideal. It's also where you put the tough issues at the table. I concur with Secretary Ross and others, of course, that impatience and lack of satisfaction about the results, because ultimately we don't talk for the sake of talks to keep having talks. You want to have resolution. And you don't want to have a committee to postpone the problem. So I agree that greater dynamism, benchmarking where the processes that got started achieve the desired results, and that you should be able to find other approaches. I think in the WTO at the moment, as a sidestep, the plurilateral way is a way to keep the system going, and perhaps speaks to your points maybe on some select themes where basically you have coalition of invested or interested parties can get around the table. It doesn't always need to involve everyone. I'm a pragmatic person and I believe we should sometimes find other ways, but within the broader context of the system that we want to reform and improve. And that's a member state responsibility first and foremost. So I don't think we will ever walk away from that. Secondly, I think I slightly disagree with you when you say, well, we should make trade agreements more about trade again. Nowadays, everything that trade does for most countries is also about creating jobs, about enforcing labor standards or ensuring and promoting and encouraging. If we go back to the days where trade was sort of only a sort of a transactional approach, I think we're not in the 21st century where everything is so interconnected. We have an opportunity actually to advance inclusive growth everywhere. And certainly our parliamentarians and our global public, the resentment, for instance, against some trade agreement precisely is the fact that many people feel we would be robbing, quote unquote, the developing world of a lot of their natural assets without actually thinking more holistically. So we are looking at an inclusive trade agenda which looks at labor standards, which looks at compliance by the member states with whom we trade themselves. We're not doing it for them, but setting standards that we are holding ourselves collectively accountable for. When it comes to the investment side, let's say dispute settlement around that, we feel very often that needs to be separate where appropriate. We get a lot of pressure in the Netherlands, for instance, from parliamentarians that say NGOs or people harmed by the investments by companies that fall under that trade agreement should find recourse as well through the dispute settlement mechanism. And we say, no, this is an investment protection scheme. Other more social issues, issues of human rights, we have to deal through the EU in the association agreement. So yeah, differentiation and some segregation, but it needs to be connected. Otherwise, I believe we're sort of not coherent with ourselves when we're looking at the global development agenda we've also signed off on, which is a universal one.
What do you think, Secretary Ross, about this concept of more inclusive trade agreements?
Well, I don't think they exist. You look at these so-called labor standards, name me an agreement that really has meaningful labor standards to it. I don't think one exists. Yes, but
Can you speak in the mic, please?
if you're a little worker in Mexico, there isn't an awful lot that the ILO standards did to give you any voting power.
That's correct, but it doesn't mean we should walk away from the ILO. And we, as through the EU, we seek to encourage and stimulate that ILO labor standards are taken into
International
account.
Labor Organization.
International Labour Organization.
Yeah. The other thing I kind of disagree with is the characterization of GATT and the way it morphed into WTO. I don't think it was really based on bilateral notions. I think it was based on what probably was good American policy then, namely to rehabilitate Europe and Asia after World War II. That was the real genesis of it. That was the purpose that it was set up for.
Yeah, let me correct myself, because what I was saying is the GATT resulted from the bilateral agreements. How the WTO morphed from the GATT is another story.
Yeah. So I just wanted to kind of correct the record there.
Can I make one point,
Please,
to what the minister said? I look at the International Telecommunications Agreement, which was essentially a tariff-based agreement. It was revolutionary. It really was probably the first international undertaking on a multilateral basis in which you really enhanced value chains around the world, and you really had a major positive impact. That was not
Can
the
you just
kind
elaborate
of...
a little, because I guess the audience is not necessarily familiar with this agreement?
The International Telecommunications Agreement, which was negotiated under the WTO auspices, but it dealt with dropping tariffs on products that are used in telecommunications. So it was very limited in scope. It didn't seek to impose labor standards. It didn't seek to do all these other things. But look at the impact that it had. And I'm just suggesting that we look at that and we wonder, maybe we should have an international coffee agreement, or semiconductors or something else that allows for free trade, promotes free trade, but also takes into account a lot of the issues I think you're talking about. You know, we can walk and chew gum at the same time, and in today's information age, it just seems to me that we can be far more sophisticated in how we're going to approach the challenges now of this amazing world order that we've created, without handing it over to certain hegemons who have a whole different idea as to how the rule book ought to be written.
I think
Minister Krag, yeah.
No, I'd just like to compliment. I concur. I think you can't turn every trade agreement into a Christmas tree. I mean, in a way, that's your point. I use the channels that we have. That's why, in a way, cross-referencing, when you have a core agreement, you say we expect branching out under that agreement to be that, and ABC should happen. Yeah, you need to be precise, you need to be focused, and sort of look at the targets you want to achieve. Equally so, however, I think it's in the 21st century, we're very keen to look at, for instance, digital trade, e-commerce, the new agenda, and I think here we see eye to eye. The unfinished business of the Doha round, if you look at WTO, important for some countries, but yet many of the countries that speak to the Doha agenda, they've long moved on. And I think this is where there's a discrepancy between our ability collectively and multilaterally to advance an agenda that is in the interest of most, versus the unfinished rounds that maybe actually are no longer that relevant. And it's a tremendously politically a missed opportunity for the effectiveness of multilateralism, and of course also a missed opportunity if we want to head into the future. We're all concerned with the impact, positive and negative, of, let's say, blockchain or the fourth industrial revolution. We need to be focusing our collective attention on that and pulling countries out so they can also connect and participate, and there is distributive wealth and standards. But all trade agreements should look at standards as much, and standards is not just in the hardcore of trade, it's also the social side. But yeah, without turning it into a Christmas tree, there are many different ways to achieve that, but we need to have consensus on the what and then the how, of course. And at the moment we seem to be struggling in the bylaws of the bylaws, and that doesn't achieve.
Rick Johnson mentioned the telecommunication agreement and mentioned that why not? There could be a coffee agreement. What is your thought on this, Ricardo Oteros? Do you think it could be more efficient to have a limited agreement on your business, on coffee business, rather than be part of big free trade agreements? Would it be relevant to address problems in your business?
What is relevant to me is that the agreement that we are making in the way to work for the creating a sustainable coffee commerce, sustainable coffee world. This is the aim of Sustainable Coffee Challenge, for instance. So to me, and I would like to remark that the private sector plays a fundamental role. So sometimes we don't feel that politicians and governments and these institutions are making rules, but sometimes we don't feel so good represented, and the real world is moving by enterprises, producers and so on. So I don't think the agreement is not just to put rules or to put barriers. The agreement is just to allow people to produce value and getting added value for everyone and shared value, So there are very many initiatives that we are working with, who are trained to do this, not rules just to put, limits or taxes or prices and so
on. I wanted to turn to Secretary Ross. In 1 or 2 days, we will know if the United States imposed tariffs on steel and aluminium, and to which countries. Just before asking another question, but do you really think that if you impose tariff on steel, it will really protect the U.S. steel industry and the U.S. steel workers? I know there are some economists, even some Republican congressmen that are worried that maybe in the longer term, the car industry might have problems because the costs will rise, because even prices will rise for consumers. How do you respond to this? There's a big concern about this.
Well, anytime you deal with subsidized dump product and eliminate it from your market, you will have an impact on price. Question is degree. Some of you probably saw I went on CNBC to dramatize that, held up a can of Campbell's soup. The total increase in cost of that can is a fraction of a penny, and the product sells for way more than $1 a can. With a car, it's under 1% of the price. Well, think about it. You don't buy a car every 10 minutes, and the options and the models and everything change. Nobody knows what's the right price for a car. So 1% change is silly. People get fixated on the notion that there are more employees in the steel consuming industries than in steel producing. That's arithmetically correct, and it's intellectually irrelevant because you have to put it into proportion. What is the actual impact on price? The sky has not fallen in the United States since we put the tariffs on. It just hasn't fallen, and it won't, because of the proportionality that I'm describing is just too small. The whole amount of tariffs on steel and aluminum are a fraction of 1% of the US GDP. So how much impact can that have on anything? It's just silly. And not a single consuming industry has refuted any one of the arithmetic comparisons we made, but they still complain, well, it's raising our costs. Well, it's true. It also creates a lot of jobs. There are something like 20 facilities that have either been started as greenfield or reopened in steel and aluminum since we announced the tariffs. That's real, that's factual. I don't see car companies closing up. I don't see can companies closing up. It's just not happening. It's not a correct view.
Any response or comments on this? No.
I think I'm not going to go into all the details because the Commissioner Malmström, the Trade Commissioner, is in constant dialogue also with the Secretary Ross.
I'm not referring to her.
No,
I'm talking about the
I know.
US.
No, I know. So I'm saying, I'm just prefacing my comment for us as an EU member state. It's important to remain in dialogue and to find, obviously, an appropriate solution. And we'll wait for the decision then in the next few days. But the relationship with the US always remains very important to us, be it politically, economically, militarily, and I think we will find ways forward.
Well, I'm sure we will, and there can be negotiations with or without tariffs in place. God knows there are plenty of tariffs the EU has in place on us, and so it's not that you can't talk just because there are tariffs.
I think the one comment I'd make on behalf
Please.
of the business community in general is there is a reaction and a thought that perhaps using our national security Section 232 approach is not the optimal approach to justify these actions based on protecting national security versus, let's say, a safeguards action.
Okay, well, I'd be happy to address that. You really have to read the enabling legislation. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 is the basis for the action. It has a very elaborate definition of national security, and it isn't by any means strictly confined to the military applications. It specifically goes into effect on employment, effect on other sectors of the economy, all sorts of things, necessary infrastructure. So while the label is national security, you need to look at the legislation itself, and the question isn't, is this mainly a military thing? It's obviously mainly not a direct military thing, but infrastructure and the economy are what gives you military security. You don't have military security if you don't have economic security. So I know people like to wave the flag, oh, well, you shouldn't use that definition. The definition is what Congress enacted long before Donald Trump became president. And so the fact that we're utilizing legislation that was passed quite a few years ago shouldn't surprise anybody.
Okay, so Europe is awaiting your decision on steel and aluminum tariffs, but you are also in talks with China. You are heading to China in the coming days. Do you really think that by adding measures, barriers, the trade deficit with China will decrease?
Well, China's a good case in point. They are paying the tariffs. Their tariffs went into effect in March when the basic ones did. China has not used that as an excuse not to negotiate. We've had several sessions with them since. I'm currently scheduled to go over again on Friday. It's only the EU that is insisting we can't negotiate if there are tariffs.
Mrs. Clark, I know Cecilia Malmström, the commissioner, is in charge with the talks, but you are a minister of one of the member states. I guess you support this position of not negotiating?
Yeah, the European leaders also spoke very
without
clearly
exemption.
in terms of they've expressed the expectation that there should be an unlimited exemption, and on that basis, discussions can continue on a number of themes. They were highlighted, as you know, just at the end, the closure of the European Leaders Summit, and that's really still, of course, guiding us. We of course, any decision that is different from that would be regretted. But I think the importance is why it's not the EU is behaving differently from China, which of course makes it rather ironic, because we are allies with the US on many issues that we find distortive trade practices by China. So I think that is maybe an optical perception, is because we feel that the rules of the game in this case would be taken to WTO. We would be looking at rebalancing, but we're finding ourselves, I think, in a situation we shouldn't be at, because we believe indeed that a 232 doesn't apply, because I understand that the laws adopted in 1960, I think, came also from that era, if one looked at it, when national security, military security, economy, military security, it's a very different era, one would argue. We don't think it applies to us in this case, and hence I think many other countries refute that argument being placed. However, dialogue with an important ally such as the US remains primordial, and we hope that somehow progress can be found. But the fact that China is in continuous negotiation, I don't think applies to us in this case. I don't take that as an argument that would sway the European Union, precisely because of all the arguments that Secretary Ross mentioned earlier in terms of distortive practices, state-subsidized engagement, etc., etc. So, you know, I understand, but I disagree.
I think these discussions are the best thing for the coffee industry, because all these lengthy meetings drives people to need lots of coffee. So
I'm one of them.
This is our contribution to free trade and coffee.
Minister Carr, you said earlier we partly covered this issue, but that you're much in favor of reforming WTO or multilateral practice. Can you tell us a bit more about what should be done to address?
I think I already spoke to part of it. I think if you look at the inordinate amount of time, and I don't follow the details of what happens, of course, in Geneva on a daily basis, but on agenda items, on committees. Now, I myself come out of the UN system too, so I understand the last two assignments, of course, were on peace and security matters and disarmament. But I understand. I have an appreciation for the time it takes and the patience required to delve into the depth of technical details and to build consensus. At the same time, I think it is the so-called old agenda, the unfinished business, versus the new and pressing issues. And more, if you look at economic changes, transformation of societies, economies, and the need to help most countries be competitive globally, there is the bulk of issues that need to be addressed now, I think, require us to change not just speed. I think that speaks to some of Secretary Ross's as well, the ability to take decisions and to work perhaps plurilaterally in a way that it complements and feeds into ultimate multilaterally agreed decisions. But we need to decide. And I think collectively the whole multilateral system is partly under duress. And I think the role is always for member states. You can't always blame the Secretariat because they take their cue from member states. But if people around the world feel that, be it the UN, WTO, elsewhere, even the EU, again, it speaks sometimes that citizens feel, well, this is just an opaque system, I don't know who decides, and if they decide I don't like it, it erodes confidence in the whole of what we're trying to achieve. So the system itself is under duress. It's upon us to say we take responsibility, we provide leadership to address it and to resolve it. And modernization, both of the agenda and our ways of working, I think is key, because ultimately you have a system to provide solutions. And if the system only indeed, to come back to Secretary Ross and some of the things you said, only actually demonstrates that a lot of us, including ourselves here today probably, are sitting in a room to talk and indeed feed the coffee industry, that's not very good in a time when real issues of peace, security, development, economic growth are at the table. People are dissatisfied, people are disenfranchised, feel excluded, and those issues need to be named and addressed. But from our side, of course, in an inclusive manner. Inclusive doesn't mean ineffective.
Ricardo, anything to add on this?
One thing really important in all of this is that trade has become a scapegoat for a lot of the problems you're talking about. And it's incumbent upon all of us, and bringing it back to where we're sitting today, the OECD needs to get out there more aggressively and explain to the people with the evidence-based information that they develop how there are other forces at work here. To me, in my day-to-day activities, it's amazing how often digital economy comes back at us in terms of the dislocations that we're talking about and how do you adapt to that, and the people who feel left behind, all those types of things. I mean, yes, trade is a factor in that, but like I was saying, once upon a time at the International Trade Commission, when we broke things down and actually looked at them empirically as to why these problems exist, very often it was not trade, and more today, I think that's the case. We have to stop using trade as a scapegoat and focus more on those issues that really are causing the kinds of problems where people are skeptical. You know, why are they skeptical about globalization? When in fact globalization has probably created, as I said at the beginning, more wealth and distributed more wealth around the world than we could have imagined in the last 70 years versus the rest of the history of mankind. I mean, it's just remarkable. And yet here we are today asking ourselves, is this really worth it? It just strikes me as bizarre almost.
Well, when you transfer wealth,
we'll get to a question from the audience. No, please, just.
And say, when you transfer wealth from middle-class people in developed countries who basically have not benefited from this globalization to people in less developed countries, you are creating a situation where there will be unrest. And that's one of the fundamental problems. The middle-class people in the United States have gone no place for a couple of decades, even though the economy has grown and even though the world has grown. It should therefore not surprise anyone that people are unhappy with that.
Okay, now it's time to. I'll take some questions from the audience. One shouldn't rely too much on technology. The questions I had on this iPad just vanished, so maybe someone could fix this. Otherwise, I'll take questions if I can see people in the room. There, I saw a lady in the room. Do we have mics in the room? Yes. So please wait for the mic. This lady in the front row. I cannot see you very well, but.
Thank you.
Please, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Thank you so much to the panel and for this discussion. My name is Deborah James, and I work at the Center for Economic and Policy Research based in Washington, D.C., and I coordinate a network of civil society organizations that works on the WTO. So I just wanted to address a couple of the points made. It seems like there was a reference to the old agenda of Doha.
Make your questions
very
short.
quick. The old agenda of Doha, the old agenda that is still around of what developing countries are asking for is more flexibilities to have policy space for development and to resolve the problem that the WTO actually limits developing countries from subsidizing their own agriculture for their own domestic consumption. So if we were to resolve those issues, it would actually allow developing countries to feed millions of people domestically without having any distortion in the trade system. And when we talk about the new issues and talking about digital economy, you know, we hear proponents say we want to close the digital divide, but what they're talking about in the WTO is creating a new charter of rights for big technology companies. So when we talk about trade nowadays, most of it is protections for pharmaceutical companies to expand intellectual property and protections for investors. And we're not talking about benefits for workers and benefits for the environment. So those of us who've been living on the receiving end of the policies are really tired of people saying, our system is so great when we see our jobs being transferred and we see developing countries still suffering, and then we see the inequality gap increasing and we see the productivity gap increasing, and yet the only solution from the proponents of the system is that they have to sell it better. The reality is we need a new system that puts workers and the environment first, not just for rights, but for the entire system, not to be designed to redistribute income upwards, which is not what trade is about. Trade is great. Trade agreements have been about redesigning income for corporations for the last 30 years, and that's what we need to change, and not just to have people say that you need to sell your system better. Thank you very much.
So that was not a real question, it was more a comment. Okay, please.
Well, you don't have any workers on this stage, so I thought maybe we could represent the position of the people who've been suffering from trade.
Thanks for your comment. I have some written questions that I'll take. Now there are some anonymous questions that I'll avoid. I prefer taking questions when the people are give their names. I have a question here from Munya, sorry for the pronunciation, Munya El Arti Alonso, director to Minister Carr. What are your thoughts on the EU initiative of plurilateral investment courts replacing arbitration in CETA, the European Union and Canada agreement, recent EU-Mexico agreement, and a possible multilateral investment court negotiated at the UN currently? It's a very specific question, but it raises some concern.
I think a number of issues in one. First of all, the investment, the settlement of disputes mechanism needs to be updated. We have sort of an interim measure. We are also proponents with a number of others of a multilateral investment court as a way to rationalize, have independence, and have sort of a system across the board. This is still under negotiation. We're a little bit far out from that one, but I think, again, we need to have the tools adjusted and aligned with the new realities. And whilst I have the mic, I'll come back to the lady who made a very interesting statement. I don't think the world is an either-or, and I certainly think most member states in the WTO are not negotiating on behalf of large corporations. We negotiate national positions with a reflective perspective on what inclusive trade can mean, what the benefits of trade will be, what a global economy could offer, and indeed aligned with standards. That's why the EU, in its trade agreements, and it's also the take in WTO, looks at sustainability, and sustainability explained and positioned in a very holistic, rights-based manner. Do the countervailing parties all accept? A lot of the countries, also developing countries in WTO, don't necessarily want to speak about human rights and trade. It's actually a number of the European countries and others that do. So I think it's fairly, it's easy to typecast the agenda in that way. And last but not least, I think we have an issue, and I think that speaks to some of the member states here as well. When developing countries, when a country is still free to determine its own assignation of economic progress and status, developing, whilst its economic base has transformed itself, that I think erodes again the effectiveness of when we're trying to negotiate. So old versus new may have been too simplistically put by myself, but I believe there is a new pressing agenda most citizens of these countries also feel offers them opportunities, in particularly women when it comes to access to the labor market, different labor market, and opportunities that technology can offer for inclusive development. But there are many fora to discuss that.
Okay. Any comments to add on the... No, Ricardo?
I would like to tell that maybe I didn't explain me properly. When I say that the 100 million persons, workers, they have faced a very big challenge, and I say that we need an holistic approach, and we have to use the SDGs. I was it's supposed that I am looking for the well-being of these people and these workers, and I work with them straight every day, face to face, and this is very hard to me. So if I didn't represent them properly, I feel bad. So it's very good needs. The thing is that I think there is not rules who will take this out. It's investment, it's research, it's producing value, because without any value you cannot do things. It's estimated that the coffee, the end of the chain worldwide, is moving around $200 billion. Actually, only $17 billion are going to the producer countries. It's 8%. It was much more 25 years ago. But the problem is not rules. The problem is that they are producing coffee like they were doing 50 years ago. Nobody has gone there to invest, to put new technologies, trying to develop more productivity. And this is what seems to me that trade can help to put together all these. So I don't understand policies, sorry. I don't understand all these rules, sorry. But I understand which is the problem. So I'm so sorry, don't explain myself properly.
Thank you. I have another question here from Stéphane Dinet, who asks us, going local seems to be an inevitable trend to create real sustainable models. From your point of view, how will this trend, the trend of going local, affect global trade? Now, does any of you agree that going local is a strong trend, and how could it affect?
I've got one comment, which is that going local can mean a lot of different things. And in our business, and frankly, in the context of what is affecting the ability to use the internet by small and medium-sized businesses, as well as the large multinationals, is this trend towards forcing localization of data processing and data storage. It's ill-conceived. It's an anachronistic perspective in that host governments are often saying to themselves, if we force data processing centers in our country and the storage of data in our country, we'll create jobs. The answer is actually, empirical analysis shows, no, then maybe you get 20 jobs. But it also forces transfer of knowledge, transfer of know-how. Actually, what happens is, for the companies who do use the internet, they want to be able to centralize and thereby more effectively protect against hacking and develop cybersecurity techniques for a centralized function versus creating so many different data points or points of potential hacking that it doesn't make sense. So forced localization in the context at least of data processing and data flow is a very bad idea. In other instances, I could see where it makes a lot of sense, but it's too easy. You know, there are way too many cliches here in the business of trade to just throw that out there and say, aha, you know, localization's good.
Yeah, I totally agree that localization of data is not the right way to go, and I think it's not being advanced for the real motives that are behind it. So I totally agree with that. But localization of manufacturing facilities, particularly as you get more into robotics, more into artificial intelligence, the equation between cutting transportation costs, cutting duration of supply chain in favor of local production may very well be a real trend in the economy of things as opposed to the digital economy. So I agree with you that it's a lot more complicated than just the word local.
Okay, I had maybe one last question that was addressed by Rory McCry. I'm not sure we will understand the question, so maybe if that person can elaborate a bit. It was addressed to Secretary Ross. Why are the concessions no longer appropriate? What are you referring to? Is Rory McCray in the room somewhere?
Okay, well, I understand the question.
Oh, okay, so the question is understood, that's fine.
And I'll try to hope he'll understand my answer.
What are you referring to?
What I was referring to is when a country has just been bombed out, literally, the idea of giving them economic benefits of all kinds, whether it's the Marshall Plan, whether it's lowering tariffs for them, whether it's anything else, is totally appropriate. When a country now is the second largest economy in the world, it's a little hard to say that they need concessions. Take an example, auto tariffs. And the reason we harp so much on auto and the reason we harp so much on China is if you look at our trade deficit, it fundamentally has two components. One is geographic, and that's China, and the other is a product, and that's automobiles. And if we're going to solve our deficit, we have to resolve both those issues, or nothing else much matters. So what I'm referring to are things like, why should the EU have a 10% tariff on cars and we have 2.5%? Why should China have a 25% tariff on cars and we have 2.5%? Why should people have wildly varying standards, even down to whether seatbelts should be really effective, mainly at low velocity crashes or high velocity? This is a lot of nonsense. This is strictly protectionism. And those are not necessary things, and we should have outgrown them a long time ago, in my view.
Time is flowing quickly, and I think we're reaching the end of this discussion. Do you wish to make a short concluding remark? It's as you wish.
I'll start.
Rick, please.
I'll start. I think the takeaway that I have from all these meetings that I have and have been doing for the last 10 years on behalf of Citibank is that there are really some really fundamental issues we've got to tackle in the 21st century. One is the digital economy, which can prove to be a boon to everyone in the world if we handle it properly. Secondly, it's regulation. The Trump administration has demonstrated that deregulation is a very healthy thing for the economy. And from a business perspective, I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in where at the very top of the list of what can governments do to better improve economic conditions and develop more economic development, it's deregulate. So that's the second one. And then the third one, I think the Secretary really and the Trump administration, again, they have focused on something that is a real challenge to the system, and that is the scale in which the Chinese model is challenging the system. There are ways to work it, and I think that there have to be developed some approaches there. But can you imagine, were it not for China in challenging this system in so many different ways, would we even be talking about this? It is such a huge issue, and I'm hoping, for example, that the OECD will start to focus more of its attention and resources on how do we work that Chinese system to modify it enough so that it doesn't create the kind of collateral damage that it's causing right now.
Thank you. Ricardo, do you want to make
Okay.
a concluding remark?
There is many challenges they face, 25 million small producers. We need alliance, we need the help of everybody, all of you included. And the only thing I can tell for finish my speech is to say you are invited to the result of one wonderful coffee produced by women in Supra Cafe outside.
Advertising. Minister Kagan.
We have lots of Dutch products, but I won't list them. No, I think 3 points. One of them, of course, is we believe firmly in sustainability and sustainable human inclusive development. And trade is an enabler. It can be distributive, redistributive, and of course, we need system, organization, and an adaptation of the rules to make sure we can achieve our new goals, because in a way they're new goals and they're more firm. I agree, we need to, I think, spend our time on the more geostrategic issues as opposed to ending up potentially squabbling with one another, because the fundamental questions are still out there in the room. And thirdly, I think it's an open invitation for all of us to think, but act fast, because it's true. I think that's also, in a way, I may call it a blessing in disguise. Maybe if you permit me, Secretary Ross, some of the decisions that may be coming, it makes us, we're all seized with a sense of urgency. Not only have we got the system right, but we've also got to tackle what you just mentioned are some of the fundamental questions, but we shouldn't lose sight of indeed 50% of the population, particularly the opportunities, but also our duty towards women and girls in particular, because we talk as if people are anonymous, but they're out there. And I think last but not least, domestic issues, there is a role for government, private sector and others, but we cannot abuse of domestic issues where there is a role for government to tackle that and make it an international issue.
Secretary Ross, one last concluding remark.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that there's a growing recognition of the urgency of changing the system. I think if there's one big takeaway from today, that gives me a good deal of encouragement, and it will make our lives easier going forward and everyone else's if there really is a commitment to action rather than discussion. I can't emphasize that enough, because if everybody really does start to act collectively, we won't have so much need to take individual action.
Well, thank you very much. I think discussion is useful before action, and we had an interesting discussion. Please join me to thank our panel. And I wish you all a good OECD forum, a nice day.
but like whatever.
No, but then we have to collect them from two places, right?
I know. What I meant was
What do you do with the
it's
water?
better if they're
Okay, but we need to clean up first, right? Before. Yeah. You need the water inside? Yeah. Okay.
No.